What if you had it all? The money, the plan, the freedom. Years of sacrifice finally paying off. A dream retirement, designed down to the last detail. But just when everything feels certain, something you never planned for shows up. Something unpredictable. Something human. This is the story of John. A man who built an empire from the ground up, who lived by numbers, logic, and spreadsheets. A millionaire who didn't believe in fairy tales, only in solid strategy. For him, life was all about building, saving, and securing a future he could control. And he did. Every move calculated, every risk measured, every outcome anticipated, or so he thought. Because one thing never made it into his plan: falling in love. In today's video, we dive deep into the life of a man who thought he had it all figured out. You'll learn how he turned rags into riches, and how his razor-sharp planning earned him a life most people only dream of. But more importantly, you'll discover the emotional twist that turned his perfect plan upside down. We'll explore not just the financial strategy behind his success, but also the psychological journey of a man forced to reevaluate everything he believed. What happens when logic meets love? What do you do when someone walks into your life and challenges the blueprint you've lived by? This isn't just another story about wealth. It's about something more rare than millions in the bank: unexpected connection, human vulnerability, and the kind of change you can't predict. So stick with us till the very end, because what starts as a story of success ends as something much deeper, a reminder that even the most carefully planned lives can take the most beautiful detours. Welcome to the channel. If you love real stories that blend strategy, emotion, and a touch of suspense, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next. He wasn't born into money. Not even close. John grew up in a small, rusted-out town where the idea of success usually meant getting a stable job at the local factory and holding onto it for dear life. His dad worked 2 shifts, his mom juggled part-time gigs, and even then, bills were paid late more often than not. But even as a kid, John had this sharpness in his eyes. A quiet intensity. While other kids played outside, he'd be inside with a stack of old newspapers, flipping through the business pages like they were comic books. He didn't understand all the numbers, but he liked the sound of them. The idea that numbers could build something bigger. He'd clip out articles about self-made millionaires and pin them to the inside of his closet, reading them every night like bedtime stories. By the time he was a teenager, he already knew one thing for sure: he wasn't staying in that town. At 18, John left with nothing but a duffel bag, a scholarship, and a dream. College wasn't easy. He worked nights at a gas station and still managed to graduate near the top of his class. But he wasn't chasing grades. He was chasing knowledge: how the markets worked, how money moved, how it grew when handled right. After school, he got a job at a mid-size firm. Entry level, barely enough to cover rent. But John had a secret weapon: discipline. While his coworkers upgraded their apartments and weekend routines with every bonus, John lived like he was still broke. He cooked at home, wore the same pair of shoes for 3 years, and put every extra cent into his savings account. Then came investing. Carefully, cautiously. He didn't follow hype, he studied fundamentals. While everyone else was chasing tech stocks, John quietly bought into undervalued industrials and real estate trusts. He wasn't flashy, but he was consistent. And slowly, the numbers started to climb. First, 5 figures. Then 6. Then 7. But the path wasn't all numbers and wins. To stay on course, John made choices. Tough ones. He skipped vacations, missed weddings, said no to spontaneous dinners, weekend getaways, and second dates. Not because he didn't care, but because he was chasing something bigger. He kept telling himself it would all be worth it once he hit that goal. Once he made enough, then he could finally relax. Then he could finally live. Years went by like this. A blur of spreadsheets, long hours, and cold dinners. Friends drifted. Relationships faded before they ever fully began. There was always something he had to do, somewhere he had to be. The grind didn't stop, and neither did he. But John didn't complain. He wore his sacrifices like a badge of honor. In his world, pain today meant peace tomorrow. Sacrifice wasn't failure, it was proof that he was serious. And in his mind, it was working. Because eventually, he made it. Millionaire status. Debt-free. Investment portfolio thriving. He had the home, the car, the lifestyle most people only dreamed of. The kind of life that screams, freedom. But here's the thing about freedom, it's only meaningful if you know what to do with it. John had spent so long building his future, he hadn't really stopped to ask what it would feel like once he got there. He thought money would fill the spaces he'd left empty along the way. But success doesn't always silence the quiet. And just when everything was finally stable, just when the numbers were right and the plan was locked in, life threw him something no spreadsheet could predict. Retirement, to John, wasn't just a phase, it was a project. A mission. The reward at the end of decades of hustle. He didn't imagine it like most people do, lazy days on a beach or afternoons lost in front of the TV. No, John's version was sharper, cleaner, perfectly outlined like a blueprint. He had a list. Actually, several. Color-coded folders, spreadsheets, reminders. He planned his retirement the same way he built his fortune, with precision. There were destinations. Japan in the spring for the cherry blossoms, Norway for the fjords, Morocco for the markets. He wanted to see the world, not from the window of a tour bus but with purpose. He'd learned 4 languages through an app during his lunch breaks over the years, just so he wouldn't feel like a tourist in the places he dreamed of visiting. There were hobbies too. Woodworking, which he never had time to try before. Sailing, which had fascinated him since he was a kid watching ships on the lake. Photography, so he could capture the places he visited and catalog the beauty in the world, one frame at a time. Each passion had its own line item in his plan: equipment budgets, training courses, books, even mentors he followed online. Then there was the giving back. This part was important to him. He wasn't a showy man, but he remembered where he came from. John had quietly supported a scholarship fund for kids in his hometown for years, but in retirement, he wanted to do more. Start a foundation. Teach financial literacy at underfunded schools. Help people break the cycle he was born into. Everything was mapped out. And behind all those dreams was a fortress of financial strategy. John didn't just save, he built layers. Multiple revenue streams. Passive income. Rental properties, index funds, dividend portfolios. A long-term care insurance policy. Emergency fund for 10 years, not one. Estate planning down to the last decimal. His accountant once joked that John's retirement plan was better documented than most corporate budgets. Every month had a forecast. Every year had a contingency. He had modeled economic downturns, inflation surges, health emergencies, even potential global instability. If one plan failed, there were 3 backups. He wasn't just trying to live well, he was trying to make sure nothing, absolutely nothing, could knock over the life he'd so carefully built. Friends would ask him if he ever worried about the future. He'd just smile. Why would he? He had run the numbers. He had run the what-ifs asterisk. To him, there was comfort in control. Peace in preparation. A quiet kind of power in knowing you were ready. So when the day finally came, when he officially stepped away from the boardroom and handed in his final report, he didn't feel nervous. He felt ready. Excited, even. This was the moment he had been working toward for decades. Not just the end of something, but the beginning of a new, perfectly calculated chapter. He stood on the edge of it, passport in one hand, to-do list in the other. Confident. In control. And completely unaware that life was about to toss that plan out the window with one smile from a stranger. It started with coffee. Not a planned meeting. Not a networking event. Not anything John would have put on a calendar. Just a quiet Tuesday morning at a small cafe tucked between a bookstore and an art gallery he'd never noticed before. He was in town to finalize some legal documents for a property sale, nothing major, just another item on the list. But when the meeting finished early, he had an hour to spare. An hour with no plan. Rare. That's when he saw her. She was sitting at the corner table, laughing at something the barista said, her curly hair tied up in a messy bun, a paint-smeared tote bag at her feet, and a half-read poetry book in her lap. She looked like someone who wasn't in a hurry. Like someone who had time. John wasn't sure why he noticed her. Or why, instead of heading back to his hotel to review paperwork like he usually would, he ordered a cappuccino and sat down 2 tables away. Close, but not too close. She noticed him, of course. She had that kind of energy, aware of everything, even things she wasn't supposed to be. "You're not from around here, are you?" she asked, smiling as if they already knew each other. That question turned into a conversation. A long one. Her name was Sarah. She was a painter, part-time teacher, part-time traveler, full-time believer in living the moment. She'd spent years backpacking across countries, chasing sunsets, sketching street corners, and collecting stories like souvenirs. She didn't have a retirement plan. She barely had a plan for next week. John, of course, found that unsettling. Maybe even a little reckless. But also, oddly refreshing. The next day, they crossed paths again. She was painting the outside of the bookstore, adding a burst of color to its plain brick wall. John stopped to admire the work. She waved him over. They ended up grabbing lunch. Then it became a thing. A casual rhythm. Coffee. Conversation. Walks through the art district. She showed him places he never would have found on his own. Hidden trails, live jazz in a basement bar, a rooftop garden above a forgotten warehouse. She had a way of pulling him out of his schedule without him noticing. They talked about everything. John told her about his past, about how numbers gave him comfort, how order made sense in a world that didn't always. She listened, not with judgment, but with curiosity. Sarah talked about chaos like it was an old friend. How her best memories came from plans that went sideways. How freedom wasn't having control, it was letting go of the need for it. He couldn't understand how she lived without structure. She couldn't imagine how he lived without room for surprises. But neither of them pulled away. Their worlds didn't align, they collided. Gently. John was used to people trying to fit into his routine or expecting him to fit into theirs. But Sarah didn't do either. She just was asterisk. And for once, he didn't feel the need to manage every moment. She never asked what he did or how much he made. She never cared about the numbers. She cared about the stories. And slowly, those casual moments started to feel like something else. Like chapters in a different kind of plan, one he hadn't written. Sometimes, the most meaningful connections begin in the simplest moments. And sometimes, a carefully built life gets its first real spark the moment it stops trying to be perfect. John never thought something as simple as a morning walk could change the rhythm of his day. But that's what Sarah did. She adjusted the tempo of his world without asking for permission. At first, it was subtle. A change in routine here, a skipped meeting there. He told himself it was harmless. Temporary. Just part of being social. But slowly, her presence began to do something his spreadsheets never accounted for, make him question the life he'd spent decades building. It started with the itinerary. John had planned a solo trip across Europe, every flight booked, every hotel reserved, each day broken into blocks of activities. It was supposed to be the kickoff to his retirement adventures. Sarah asked to see the plan, and when he handed over the neat stack of printed confirmations, she laughed, not in a cruel way, but in disbelief. "You don't even leave room to get lost," she said, flipping through the pages like it was a company report. "Getting lost isn't efficient," he replied without thinking. "Maybe not," she shrugged, "but that's usually where the magic happens." That sentence lingered in his mind longer than it should have. He began noticing things. How she stopped to talk to strangers. How she wandered through museums without a guide or a schedule. How she chose restaurants by smell, not reviews. It made him uneasy at first, watching someone move through life with no roadmap. But it also made him curious. One Saturday, Sarah invited him to a community dance event. No reservations, no program, just live music, open space, and people moving like nobody was watching. John resisted. Dancing wasn't in his skill set. Spontaneity even less so. But she didn't pressure him. She just said, "Come if you feel like it." He stood at the edge of that dance floor for almost 20 minutes. Watching, hesitating, until something in him softened. He stepped in, not gracefully, not confidently, but willingly. Sarah took his hand and smiled like she'd been waiting all along. It felt terrifying. And freeing. He started doing more things that scared him. Unscripted things. He let her take him hiking, without checking the trail map first. He painted a mural with her, even though he hadn't held a brush since grade school. He tried food he couldn't pronounce, played board games with her nieces, stayed up past midnight just talking. But along with those new experiences came new questions. Heavy ones. He'd spent years keeping his emotions in check, believing feelings were distractions. Now, he found himself wondering what it would mean to actually let someone in. To alter the plan. To share it. Could he love someone whose life looked nothing like his? Was he ready to shift the foundation of a future he'd already built? And if he wasn't, why did the idea of going back to his old life suddenly feel incomplete? There were nights he'd sit in his perfectly organized study, staring at the spreadsheets he once trusted blindly. For the first time, they didn't feel like anchors, they felt like chains. He'd look at his bucket list and wonder if he'd missed the point all along. Because while his lists included countries and hobbies, they didn't mention people, connection, emotion, vulnerability. Sarah never asked him to change. She never suggested he abandon his structure or throw away his plans. She just was, a reminder that life could be lived differently. That it didn't have to be either safe or wild. That maybe there was something powerful in the in-between. John didn't have the answers yet. But for the first time in a long time, he was open to the questions. Love didn't arrive in John's life like a thunderstorm. It came quietly, like a soft rain that soaks the earth before you even realize it's falling. One day, he and Sarah were sharing stories over coffee like they always did, and the next, well, something was different. Not louder, not more dramatic. Just deeper. It wasn't a grand confession or a single moment of clarity. It was the slow, steady pull of connection. The kind that builds from trust. Their friendship had always been easy, even when it was wrapped in contrast. John's logic, Sarah's feeling. His structure, her spontaneity. But as weeks turned into months, those differences started to feel less like opposites and more like balance. They began to lean on each other in quiet, unspoken ways. John started bringing Sarah along to events he once would have attended alone. Book launches, museum exhibitions, lectures on finance. At first, she'd joke that he was trying to culture her into spreadsheets, but she came anyway. And when she didn't understand something, she'd ask, genuinely curious, never pretending. Sarah, in return, brought John into her world. Art festivals, community dinners, beach cleanups, even a pottery class where John shattered his first 2 attempts and nearly gave up, until she whispered, "Imperfection is the point." He kept the lopsided bowl they made that day. One evening, they took a road trip to a coastal town she loved. No reservations, no map, just the open road and the music from her old playlist humming through the speakers. They stayed in a guesthouse run by an elderly couple, ate fresh seafood by the pier, and watched the stars wrapped in a shared blanket on a quiet dock. That night, under a sky John couldn't chart or predict, he reached for her hand and didn't let go. From that moment, it was no longer just friendship. Their conversations deepened. They talked about what scared them, what healed them, what they hoped they still had time to become. John told her about his childhood, his hunger to escape the cycle of poverty, and the loneliness he carried with his success. Sarah opened up about her father's death when she was 17, and how that loss shattered her trust in long-term plans. She explained how living in the now wasn't a philosophy, it was survival. It wasn't always easy. There were bumps. Real ones. John still had a habit of over-planning. He once scheduled an entire weekend itinerary for a spontaneous getaway, printing it out and placing it in her bag. She laughed at first, then gently told him she didn't want every hour decided before they even left. Sarah, for her part, would sometimes disappear into her own world, canceling plans last minute, chasing inspiration when it struck. It frustrated John, who found comfort in commitment. They had to talk. Often. More than either of them were used to. They had to learn not just how to love each other, but how to understand each other. But through it all, there was something solid underneath: respect. John admired Sarah's courage to live freely. She admired his strength in building stability. They didn't try to change each other. They listened. They adjusted. They grew. Sarah didn't erase John's need for structure, she helped soften it. Showed him that not every minute had to be maximized, that joy wasn't something to schedule. And John gave her a kind of grounding she hadn't known she needed, a safe place to land, a partner who could build a future without fear. Their love wasn't flashy. It was honest. Built on shared moments, mutual care, and the choice, every single day, to keep showing up for each other. And in a life full of plans, projections, and long-term forecasts, John found something he never expected: the beauty of simply being with someone, without knowing exactly where it would lead. There was a moment, quiet, simple, when John caught himself standing in the middle of his home office, staring at a wall of neatly labeled folders. Each one represented years of planning, investment strategies, tax documentation, travel schedules, real estate holdings, charitable giving projections. He knew every sheet, every tab, every number. They had always brought him comfort, clarity. But now, all he saw was a life designed to be lived alone. Sarah's toothbrush was in his bathroom, her scarf draped over his reading chair. Her laughter still lingered in the hallway from the night before. And something inside him had shifted, softened. He wasn't questioning his logic or the importance of being prepared. He was questioning whether preparation alone had ever really been enough. He thought back to the plans he'd made at the start of retirement. The global itinerary, the solo activities, the rigid budgets, everything mapped to perfection. But Sarah wasn't a footnote he could squeeze into an existing framework. She was her own chapter, vivid, unpredictable, full of color and contradictions. And if he wanted to keep her in his life, he couldn't just fold her into a plan designed without her. The realization came slowly, but clearly. Retirement wasn't the final act of life, it was just the first one where he had the freedom to choose how to live. For weeks, John wrestled with himself. Could he adjust his goals without abandoning them? Could he trade some control for connection? He began reevaluating not just the logistics, but the meaning behind everything he'd built. The trust funds, the investments, they were important, sure. But would they matter if he spent the next 20 years without someone to share them with? He didn't need to throw away his retirement plan. He needed to redesign it. One of the first things he changed was his travel schedule. He'd originally booked a solo tour through Eastern Europe, flights, hotels, guides, every detail sorted. But now, instead of locking in a strict timeline, he called Sarah and asked, "What if we just started with Prague? And figured out the rest as we go?" She laughed, of course, thrilled by the idea. He also took another look at his calendar. Not just what was on it, but why it was there. Weekly finance meetings, language classes, strategic volunteering efforts, things that filled time but didn't necessarily fill him. Slowly, he began creating space. Space for weekends with Sarah's family. Space for late-night painting sessions, even if he was just the assistant cleaning brushes. Space for mornings with no alarm, no plan, just the sun rising and the coffee brewing and the quiet comfort of not being alone. He revised his will to include Sarah, not in the way that suggested ownership, but in a way that reflected importance. He even talked to his financial advisor about something he'd never seriously considered before, buying a small cottage outside the city. Something cozy, unstructured, somewhere they could disappear for a few days at a time. Every step felt like shedding an old layer. Not abandoning the past, but making room for something new. And still, there were moments of doubt. John had spent a lifetime believing that emotional vulnerability came with risk. That feelings were unpredictable, messy, and best kept at a distance. But what Sarah taught him, without ever saying it outright, was that some risks are worth taking. Because what's the point of being secure, if you're not also fulfilled? What's the value of comfort, if it comes at the cost of connection? One night, they sat on the balcony of her apartment, watching city lights flicker in the distance. She leaned into him and said, "You know you don't have to choose between stability and love, right? You can have both, if you let yourself." He didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. His arm wrapped around her shoulder. His eyes softened. And in his mind, for the first time in a long time, the future felt wide open, not because he had planned it that way, but because he was finally ready to live it. They didn't sit down one day and draft a formal blueprint. That wasn't how Sarah worked. And strangely enough, John didn't feel the need this time either. Instead, their new vision for the future came together slowly, like a shared painting, one brushstroke at a time. Conversations over dinner became more intentional. What kind of life did they want? Where would they live, city, countryside, or somewhere in between? John suggested a coastal town with a calm rhythm and decent Wi-Fi. Sarah dreamed of a home with big windows, space to paint, and a garden she could get her hands into. Eventually, they found a middle ground, a cottage near the water, not too far from the city, filled with natural light and possibility. Merging finances took patience. John, with his spreadsheets and structured funds, approached it like a business transaction. Sarah, on the other hand, wanted to make sure the decisions still reflected who they were, independent, yet connected. They kept separate accounts but built a shared one for travel, home projects, and spontaneous getaways. It was a balance that felt honest. They carved out routines that allowed freedom without sacrificing connection. Mornings were slow, with shared coffee and separate reading corners. Afternoons were for joint projects, her art, his volunteering. Evenings often ended with music playing softly in the background, 2 glasses of wine, and no need to fill the silence. For John, retirement no longer looked like a series of accomplishments. It looked like a shared life, less rigid, more human. And for Sarah, it wasn't about losing her spontaneity, it was about finding someone who gave it roots. Together, they discovered that love didn't have to interrupt the plan. It could be the part that made it whole. Somewhere between the quiet mornings and the spontaneous road trips, John realized his life had shifted, not in a way he could chart on a graph or file away in a folder, but in his heart. The man who once measured fulfillment in numbers and milestones had discovered something far more profound: the power of connection. Love didn't just add warmth to his world, it rewrote the very rhythm of it. John hadn't lost his sense of structure. He still found comfort in planning, in having a safety net. But now, he left room for detours. For laughter that bubbled up without reason. For days that didn't start with a checklist. And most importantly, for someone else's dreams to exist alongside his own. His transformation wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, honest, real. But to him, it was everything. If there's anything John's journey reveals, it's this: you can prepare for nearly every part of life, secure the funds, outline the timeline, predict the variables. But life, in its infinite wisdom, always keeps 1 or 2 surprises hidden just around the corner. And sometimes, those surprises are the very best parts. So, if you're out there building your perfect future, keep going. Make your plans. Protect your peace. But also, stay open. Stay curious. Leave space for the unexpected. Because the best parts of life often aren't the ones you planned for, they're the ones that find you when you least expect it. Thank you for being here with us today. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think twice about your own path, make sure to hit that subscribe button. There's more to come, more stories, more truth, more heart. Until next time, stay open to the beauty you can't plan for.